here with Dave Malekpour of Augsburger Monitors. Dave is a guy that I believe is the busiest man in the business, I like to say. Yeah. Um, Dave does a lot of things. Today, we'd like to talk to him about monitoring in general. He has an awesome company that I think is one of a kind called Augsburger Monitors. Dave, to start, why don't you tell us a little bit how you got into monitoring?
Well, my history with monitors goes back to really around 1993. I became the distributor of Dyne Audio Acoustics and actually we're the first distributor in the world for them and brought them to the US. And that got us in front of a lot of customers who wanted speakers. And they had some really cool main monitors that we sold quite a lot of. And in the process, learned a lot about speaker tuning, measuring rooms, and understanding what actually happens. Um, when you put a large speaker in a room and how to control that. And we started using DSP to tune them all the way back then, which the DSP engines then didn't sound like as good as they do today. And
What
you
year
could
was that around?
around '94 we started using DSP, and those early units had some artifacts to them. But the benefit of them was that we could really dial in the frequency response, have it be phase coherent, and really articulate a system in a room that allowed it to be accurate for mixing and for the listener. And I think one of the biggest struggles that a lot of people have with their monitoring, whether it be a small near field or a really big speaker or anything in between, is that what we're really looking for in a monitoring system is the connection between what's actually been recorded and what you're hearing. And if you can hear better, you can do a better job. Most engineers, the first thing that they would tell you about what's the most important thing to them in the studio, and it's going to be their monitoring experience, because it's how you find out what you've got. If your speakers aren't well tuned or well positioned, a lot of times you end up having to go and get multiple references. And I think if you
Go out to the car and
yeah, everyone has a Jeep test or whatever, whatever your car is, or your home stereo, or and I think it's relevant to go out and hear something in a car, because that's where a lot of people enjoy music today. I think, a set of Apple earbuds is another relevant, what does it sound like coming out of an Apple computer? Um,
it's a common tool that people listen.
a lot, yeah, from a listener standpoint, not an engineering standpoint. But what we're really after is that what I hear in the studio is what I've recorded and captured. And so I've really focused on creating a listening environment for people that, for engineers and producers and artists, that reflects that direct connection with the music.
You talked about DSP a little bit. Not everyone might be too informed on what DSP is as far as from a monitoring standpoint. Do you want to?
Sure. Uh, so digital signal processing, DSP, is a method of using digital technology to control your speaker system. And in the past, we used an analog crossover and an analog EQ to control the sound. And the challenge with those devices is that they have a lot of phase um, interaction with the signal, and they also don't have unlimited variability, or uh, the old school systems, including the Augspurgers that have been made prior to my starting to make them. And people still today kind of wrestle with, should I have an analog setup, old school style with an analog crossover and an analog graphic EQ, or maybe a parametric EQ, or should I use the new DSP type products like what are in the Augspurger amps? Um, and when you asked about the history of like how I got into this, I started with Dyne Audio, which is a very pristine type of product and incredible drivers and really well thought out product. Super engineered, Danish, manufactured at a very high standard. Um, and one of the things, along the way, a client in New York, Unique Recording, had said, "Hey, Dave, I love those Dynes, and I've listened to them a bunch, and I think, I'm on the fence, but then I went out to LA and I heard a pair of these Augspurgers, and I really want to get those, but I understand you can't buy them. You know, could you make me a pair?" And that set me off on this journey that started almost 24 years ago. And I called George Augspurger and I purchased the design for a pair of classic 215s. And when I got the drawings, it was a couple, it was a line drawing on a piece of paper and had a picture where the horn would go. And I had to set out to make my own horn based on finding an original horn and copying it. And we found a lot of things about the way the horn was made, and we spent a lot of time kind of understanding what it did. But I made a set of horns and I made a set of cabinets, and we installed them in Unique Recording in about 1997 or so. Um, and that really launched the desire for these speakers in the um, burgeoning hip hop and R&B market. That was a pretty strong part of New York sound. Um, and weeks later, another studio, Right Track, called me and said, "Hey, we heard those. We need to get a pair." And that just started this whole thing. And a few years later, I suddenly had 30 pairs of speakers in New York City. And one of the things that I had done with the speakers was add in subwoofers that um, those original systems that people had heard were just 2A with 15s and a horn. And by adding an 18-inch sub, in some cases two 18-inch subs, we're able to get a kind of incredible low end response that really responded to the way music was developing, where people were using 808 samples or actual 808 drum machines and samples that would go down super low. Today, music, it's pretty much a given that products like Pro Tools and Studio One and Logic and pretty much every DAW goes down to 20 hertz or better. Every converter can capture that pretty much linear. Even the least expensive converter can capture a very linear signal down to 20 hertz. Um, and so if you're recording that much information, I think it's really important to hear down there. And what we found in our research and design is that by having a really flat system down into the 20 hertz range, whether it's, not every room can support that. So a lot of rooms that we tune, they're pretty good down to 28 or 30. But that's really useful information because it's also where a lot of power in a mix is is contained, and people don't really totally understand the power curve of a speaker. But, as you go lower and lower, it requires more and more amperage and more, watts to get the same level. So something that's, let's say, at 400 hertz versus 100 hertz, you need 4 times as much power to create 100 hertz than you do 400 hertz. And then when you get to 20 hertz, you need, 5 times as much power than you do at 100 hertz. So um, when you look at our systems, people often go like, why are they so powerful? How come you have so much power? And for me, that power is headroom. It's the ability to create low frequency without distortion, without hearing the amplifier clip or actually not be able to deliver that clarity, and that interferes with vocal clarity and interferes with how the bass is perceived. And even like if you look at something like 200 hertz does actually contain harmonics from 50 hertz and 100 hertz and 25 hertz, and they're components that we hear. And most people when they're recording don't go like, I need 200 hertz right now. Like they need the bass, they need the bottom end. And we've done a lot of experimenting in rooms, and if we don't have a natural 30 hertz in the bottom end, it's hard to make it really feel like something. You can get the bass, but to feel it, you really need sort of like the rudimentary part of the bass from, let's say, 28 to 45 hertz, and then but that part isn't something that's like where all the detail is, but it supports where the detail is, and all these things are kind of one thing in reality. And when we listen to a speaker system, we don't go like, oh, I can hear the third octave harmonic, and identify that and as this little piece. We hear it as, I hear a really full bass, or I hear articulation in the way the bass player is able to get the feeling. So a lot of what I'm going for is incredible accuracy and responsiveness. And so we also have chosen in our design, we have extremely high sensitivity drivers. So every driver in our system has at least 100 dB sensitivity. Now you ask, hey, what is that measurement, Dave? What does that mean, sensitivity? And what it really means is how many watts, or I should say, how many decibels you can get from the speaker at one with 1 watt measured at 1 meter. So when you look at a speaker's sensitivity, it'll say, 93 dB and or 96 dB. Ours are 100 dB, and the horn is 110 dB when it's loaded into the horn. It's about 104 before it goes into the horn, and then in the horn it's about 110 decibels. So what that means is that the amp doesn't have to work that hard, number one. So our design components are a combination of using very high sensitivity drivers and then very high power amplifiers that are very fast. And so part of what our sound is all about is delivering quickly and getting the transients to be as lifelike as possible. So when you hit a snare drum or you hit the cymbals or the way the bass hits, that it's really representing what's there. Um, and a lot of how we perceive sound is based on the leading tones, the things that hit us first. And so those leading edges, if they can all be in time and if they can all be very fast, we can get a really realistic picture and image of what that sounds like. And that's, I think that's actually absolutely critical to the way we perceive sound in a studio. And so when we're designing studios, we try to make sure that the listening position is absolutely 100% where the listener really needs to be, and that the speakers are positioned absolutely correctly for that environment, so that both that the listening position of the engineer, but also where the producer is going to be, that those things are all considered in the way that the sound is going to be delivered. And in an optimum room, we are able to get the direct signal from the speaker to the listening positions without the room. It's one of the reasons that people love near field monitors and move towards them for so long, because rooms got less and less designed and acoustics are more and more expensive, and people are building these smaller and smaller spaces. So they put a speaker, 3 feet apart and 3 feet from the listening position, or 4 feet. And by the time that same speaker hits the wall or hits the ceiling, it's already far behind the listening. So and this is all about the direct signal, right? So a near field helps us get the direct signal without the room. With an Augspurger speaker, with the horn loading and the power curve that we have, we're able to put the listener ahead of the room. And almost as long as the speaker is well positioned, you're going to get that sound before the room. And therefore, the room design and the flaws that every room have are less important to the listening position. We also have a tuning component because of the DSP, where we can control the gain between the drivers. We can control the EQ for every driver. We can also EQ the entire signal. So if there's something that's at the crossover point, or we want to just simply create some presets to give the listener a couple of different choices. So let's say a really great mixing curve and maybe a really great production curve where it's a little more exciting, a little more inspiring for an artist without being completely fake. Or maybe you need to be able to do previews for record companies. And, the Augspurgers have a tendency to be very, very revealing, which is incredible for mixing and for recording. As a listening system, and you want things to be sweetened, we would tune it differently. And that's where the power of these preset capabilities are, and having an on-site tuning. What's involved there is we come out and, take a really a good amount of time getting the positioning of the speakers right if it's a freestanding environment. Obviously, if it's a soffit mounted system, we try to work with the designer and the builder to make sure that that position is going to be perfect at the listening position, so that the listener is inside the aperture. With a horn loaded system, we have some really great benefits. One is that we have a controlled dispersion in the Augspurger horns, both the smaller and the larger horns. That dispersion is 70 degrees on the vertical axis and 100.
Is that are they both the same dispersion rates in
They
both
they
sets?
have
Okay.
they have the same geometry and the same dispersion. The smaller horn has a shorter throw, so it's designed to be able to sit very close to it. You can actually sit 1 meter away and get the entire speaker accurately. Whereas the bigger horn, you want to be at least 2 meters, like 6 feet, roughly speaking. And tends to be that the bigger horn is better for like a bigger room where you want to fill a bigger space. Although we do have clients that are sitting 6 and 7 feet from them as near fields, and get incredible results. The funny thing about a 15-inch driver is that it actually can articulate things that a 6-inch or 8-inch driver can never articulate. And once you hear that and understand that, a lot of our mix engineers and artists love the way that gives them extremely detailed information in the lower octaves. which is a really big place in music today. And it's also just energy wise, it's a big part of the music. If you look at how much energy it takes to create that 100 hertz or that, you know, 50 hertz or 200 hertz, it's a lot more than, let's say, the high end where, at 10K, it's a very small little teeny fraction, and very small amount of power to required. Um, there's some incredible reasons why the Augspurger also works so well. One being that the horn is crossed over fairly low. On the big horn, we're crossing over right around 900 hertz. That means that everything from 900 hertz up is coming from one point source, and it's an incredibly phase coherent source. And by the way, we're controlling the dispersion, so we can actually put the image exactly where we want it. We want it where the listener is, and we want it to clear the console, and we want it to clear the ceiling and the sidewalls, so we can angle the speaker in such a way where those reflections are pushed behind the listener instead of being in the same space as the listening position. And that's, I think, some of the magic of the Augspurger. And I think the other part is that, with a wooden horn, it's almost like an instrument itself. They resonate, they have a warmth to them. And I experimented with some.
I was gonna ask, did you have a process of seeing what worked best for the horn, or because I've seen other products that like a horn-based product.
Well, I found that composite materials don't resonate so well. They're very dull and dark, and metal horns have a kind of ring to them, and fiberglass horns have a kind of boing to them. Every material actually has a tone. Like, actually, one of the weird things that I find myself doing is tapping on things to hear what that material sounds like. What does that wood door sound like? What does the plastic shell of this other speaker sound like? And, when you walk up to a plastic horn and you tap on it, that sound is in your sound. If you go and tap on a wooden horn on the Augspurger, there is no, there isn't a resonant there, and because of that, it can ring in a certain way that's very musical. We use a hard maple, and it's we start with a piece of solid wood. On the big horns, it starts with a 3-inch thick by 12-inch wide board that literally we mill down in our wood shop here and get it to the exact right size, and then it's shaped on a CNC machine. But it's carved out of one solid piece of wood, and when you take that horn off the shelf in the wood shop, and hopefully we'll be able to take people on a little tour and show you what that looks like. But if you pick up that horn and you sing into it, you can hear that your voice sounds extremely articulate and rich and present. And I think it's part of what makes them sound the way they are. We also use the very best components. Being a boutique manufacturer and not a volume manufacturer, we can choose the very most high-end components. So our drivers are all of the very best component choices. The diaphragm itself is a 99.9% pure beryllium diaphragm that's formed out of a piece of solid beryllium, as opposed to like a sputtered diaphragm, which is metal sputtered onto mylar or something like that, like some of the other types of uh, beryllium diaphragms that are out there. Ours is actually formed out of a piece of beryllium at 6,000 degrees, and that's what it takes to affect it. So it can handle incredible level, and beryllium has some incredible components about it. One being that it's the lightest and strongest tensile strength metal. I think it's number 6 on the periodic chart, so it's
Wow.
extremely pure. And it's used for things like the X-ray plate. So like when they take your X-ray, and that's part of the process of getting an X-ray. It has to be precision. It has to be non-magnetic. So it's a really interesting metal, and it also has one other really killer property about it, which is it's very fast at dissipating energy. So when it's excited by the signal going into it, it also stops ringing almost immediately. So what you're hearing is exactly what's coming out of it. It's not got any extended ring like titanium and aluminum. Other products that are in diaphragms typically have much longer resonant periods. So um, if you measure the diaphragm's performance, you're going to hear whatever you put into it, and inside of milliseconds, that resonance stops. So you're able to get an uncolored response out of it. And a component like that costs a lot of money. Um, that diaphragm costs more than some whole speakers that are in the market today that people trust for their mixing. So we, we've put things like that into the product. The amplifiers again are 0.003 distortion through the entire power range up to 98% amp power. So whether you're listening at a low level or mid level or high level, the sound doesn't change. We don't have like a power curve where you have to have the speaker cranked up a certain level just to get the bass sound. These, one of my clients, Teddy Riley, when I was tuning his system, he goes, Dave, a lot of people, when they get your system, because they're so big and impressive, they want to know how loud it'll go. He's like, what I love about them is how broad the dynamic range is. He's like, when I'm mixing, a lot of what I do is I put my monitor pot down to 1 or 2 clicks, and that could be 65 or maybe 70 dB. And I'll work all day getting my mix right. And when I can hear the kick and feel it, and the snare and the vocal and everything sounds absolutely perfect at that low level, yeah, then I go and I turn it up to stun, and I can really knock myself on the on the floor. But he's like, I don't start there. I start with how quietly I can get my mix to work. And he's like, on other speakers, I can't get the bass. I don't hear the way the snare pronounces. So something in the way that these amplifiers are able to produce the same signal at all levels, I think, is a really useful tool for engineering and production and mixing. Because if you can get your bass response at a low level, A, you can work a long time. B, you might actually hear things in detail that you wouldn't hear at a higher level. High level always makes things more exciting, but our ear also starts to compress. So for a lot of clients, they want to be able to treat the Augspurger as both a big main monitor when the client wants it, and a near field when they're mixing and working on sounds and really dialing in their sound. And it's, I think, an extremely powerful tool at that.
It's what I think separates Augsburger from other large monitors is the low end, and you can. It's obvious that there's just something different about it, more accurate, more rounded. You feel it, and it is coherent with other frequencies. I think it's a great product. And when I first um, stepped into large monitoring, you realize that it's an experience. It's not just you're listening to big speakers that are loud. It's the stereo imaging that is coming to you. It's an experience, and you can place things. It almost creates. You can almost visualize where things are within a mix. So I think it's an important tool.
We appreciate your interest in what we do. And if people want to find out more, they can go to augspurger.com. That's AUGSPURGER.com. And you can always reach out. We love to talk to clients. We're an open door for tours and visits, and we'd love to be a destination for anybody who's interested.
Some of the nicest, most genuine people in the business up here in
Well, thanks,
Hanover.
man. I really appreciate it.